The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 3642 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. Favorably reported. Chair recognizes Mr. Biggs. Roll call has been requested by Mr. Biggs. That will be rolled into when we, as previously announced, further proceedings on the bill will be postponed. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 9598, the Office of National Drug Control Policy Reauthorization Act of 2024. The clerk please designate the bill.
H.R. 9598, the Office of National Drug Control Policy Reauthorization Act of 2024, a bill to amend the Office of National Drug Control Policy Reauthorization Act to reauthorize such office and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill should be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes himself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 9598 is offered by Mr. Comer of Kentucky.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and the amendment. We have a drug overdose crisis in this country. It is unacceptable and intolerable. In 2019, roughly 70,000 people in the United States died of an overdose. In 2021, that number rose to over 106,000, and in 2022, over 111,000. In 2023, overdose deaths remained over 100,000, with over 107,000 Americans dying of an overdose. Overdose deaths remain near record highs. This is an ongoing, deadly national emergency that affects every community in our nation. The Office of National Drug Control Policy, or ONDCP, was established in the Executive Office of the President with a specific mission to coordinate the government-wide resources to combat the loss of life and human misery caused by illicit narcotics and overdoses. This bill, the Office of National Drug Control Policy Reauthorization Act of 2024, will reauthorize ONDCP and 2 critical grant programs the office administers at current spending levels for the next 7 years. Specifically, the bill will reauthorize the High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program, which helps local law enforcement coordinate efforts to take down drug traffickers, and the Drug-Free Communities Program, which works in communities across the country to prevent young people from ever trying drugs in the first place. I commend the great Americans who work hard to get results through the Drug-Free Communities Coalitions. We listened to these coalitions and ensured that the grant limitation for local communities was increased from $125,000 to $150,000 and gave the ONDCP director the ability to award up to 2 additional grants to eligible coalitions rather than the previous limit of 1. I want to thank Congressman John Duarte of California and Elisa Slocum of Michigan for their efforts to reauthorize HIDA. Key elements of this bipartisan bill, H.R. 7185, have been incorporated into the reauthorization bill to ensure that HIDA resources are used to combat fentanyl, including granting the Attorney General the authority to temporarily reassign U.S. attorneys to prioritize fentanyl trafficking. I'm sure that every single member of this committee knows constituents and their families who have been tragically impacted by illicit narcotics, especially synthetic opioids like fentanyl. No drug has affected our communities more in recent years than fentanyl. The DEA has assessed that virtually all of the deadly fentanyl found in the United States is mass-produced by transnational criminal organizations in Mexico using precursor chemicals sourced from China and then smuggled into the United States across the southwest border. This bill requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to assess how an increase in encounters at the southwest border affects DHS's ability to prevent the unlawful entry of fentanyl and other illicit drugs into the United States. It also directs the ONDCP director to coordinate with the Departments of Homeland Security, Justice, and State to ensure that the appropriate agencies are properly resourced to ensure that traffickers of illicit drugs are held accountable under Title VIII immigration authorities. I want to also thank Congresswoman Gonzalez Cullen of Puerto Rico and Stacey Plaskett my friend from the U.S. Virgin Islands for their work on H.R. 920 and ensuring that the Caribbean counter-narcotic strategy is codified in this reauthorization package, ensuring that ONDCP will properly assess the threat of drug trafficking into the United States through the Caribbean. Ranking Member Raskin, I want to thank you and your staff for working with us to make this important bill a reality over the past year. H.R. 9598 represents an important reauthorization effort in the House Oversight Committee's legislative jurisdiction. I also want to thank the chairs and ranking members of the Energy and Commerce and House Judiciary Committee and their professional staff for closely coordinating our shared jurisdiction within this bill. I urge all of my colleagues to support this bipartisan bill so we can keep the U.S. government's collective resources and the next administration properly focused on addressing the national drug crisis in our great country. I now yield to the ranking member for his statement.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for advancing this important bipartisan legislation to reauthorize ONDCP. The Office of National Drug Control Policy coordinates the whole of government response to the nation's addiction and substance abuse crisis. We know that we are struggling with a profound epidemic, but new data shows that opioid overdose deaths have decreased as of November 2022, due in no small part to the actions of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. To address the addiction overdose crisis, the administration understands the need to address the problem at both of the supply and demand levels. ONDCP has already taken decisive action to intercept the flow of fentanyl and other illicit substances into America. This reauthorization will help to tackle the problems of supply, including by funding the High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program, providing more than $275 million in grant-making to law enforcement entities to help keep harmful drugs off the streets. The reauthorization also helps to confront problems of demand. The Drug-Free Communities Program, for example, brings together 35,000 people across the country to help prevent and combat youth substance use. I'm proud the authorization would make sure this grant program continues. Research shows that harm reduction strategies work. Under the Biden-Harris administration, ONDCP has adopted harm reduction strategies as part of the national campaign to address the addiction crisis and save lives. The office has supported communities' access to naloxone, syringe service programs, and fentanyl test strip distribution. The legislation will allow the office to continue its harm reduction efforts and will direct an evidence-based examination of opioid reversal medications like naloxone. During last year's hearing examining reauthorization, I raised my concerns about the need to identify and respond to emerging illicit drug threats, including xylazine, a street drug used by veterinarians as a tranquilizer for large animals. I'm glad to see this legislation will allow the office to continue this work to address new threats as they come to market and plague our communities. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and your staff for working on this bipartisan legislation. I'm happy to support reauthorization through 2031. I yield back.
Would my friend yield?
Yes, by all means. I yield to the gentleman. I yield to the gentleman from Virginia.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
I thank the ranking member for yielding. May I ask him a question? Is the ranking member in possession of a letter I sent him and the chairman on September 16th? With respect to Schedule F.
Yes, I am very much in possession of the letter addressed to Chairman Comer and to myself on September 16th.
And in
by you. Yep.
And in that letter, is it not the case that I request and have requested that the bill, H.R. 1002, Saving the Civil Service Act, should be marked up and should be added to a markup before we break for the election?
Very much so.
And can I inquire of the ranking member, does he share that view?
Yeah. The letter advances the proposal to put into the markup session, H.R. 1002, your legislation to save the Civil Service Act and to defend the professional civil service against efforts to replace it and trash it. And I think this is a matter of some urgency.
And would it not be true, Mr. Ranking Member, that in fact this is bipartisan legislation that passed the previous Congress on the floor of the House and was passed out of this committee?
Yes, it passed in the last Congress. and it deals with proposals like from the Project 2025 to replace more than 50,000 federal employees with people who are party loyalists appointed directly by the president.
And would the ranking member find it striking to know that prominent Republican officials from Republican administrations, including, inter alia, the Central Intelligence Agency Director Mike Hayden, former Deputy Homeland Security Secretary James Loy, former Director of National Intelligence Mike McConnell, former Deputy Secretary of State and Director of National Intelligence John Negroponte, and former Navy Secretary and NASA Administration Sean O'Keefe, have in fact endorsed this legislation and registered their disapproval of the proposed Schedule F in Project 2020.
Well, those are serious professional civil servants, current and former, who want to defend the idea of merit in the federal workforce.
I thank the ranking member for yielding.
You bet.
Do any other members seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman,
Chair recognizes Mr. Biggs from Arizona.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will